Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. If you would, please turn your Bibles to Psalm 13. Are you a control freak? Are any of your friends or some other people you know control freaks? Or maybe you would say you're more of a free spirit. You just do whatever happens. You just let the hits of life just take you. Let the wind blow you wherever you go. How can you tell the difference between a free spirit and a control freak? I think a good way to discern differences between the two would to put them in the same situation. Think of how maybe one or the other would act on a plane. How would a control freak act on a plane? Well, maybe the control freak is wondering about the credentials of the pilot, the safety precautions taken before the inspections on the plane. What would the free spirit be wondering about on the plane? Maybe his number one concern is, when am I going to get my free pretzels? There's a stark contrast between the two, and I think a question that might arise in our heads is, which one's better? Is it better to, on one hand, be the control freak who is worried about all the safety precautions, and in a lot of people's minds, he's right for worrying so, or the free spirit who's really just here and concerned about having a good time? And more importantly, what does the Bible say? Does the Bible say if one is better than the other, or is there one we ought to be more like? Well, in Psalm 13, we can see David's response and how David responds to a trial. And actually, David's response is a little bit of both. His response actually meets in the middle of both. And in this psalm, we're going to see how David responds in his trial, and it's a model of how believers should respond in their trials. David responds by having an active dependence on God in his trial, and that's the same response believers are to have in the midst of their trial. The control freak may be dependent on his own abilities. The free spirit may just be dependent on having a good time. But as Christians, we are called to put our dependence on God. We'll look more at the idea of active dependence in this passage. But what I mean by active dependence is that as Christians, we are to constantly be engaging with God through prayer and studying His Word. But at the same time, trusting God's will and not taking things into our own hands. So let's read the passage and see if you can see any aspect of David's active dependence on God. Psalm 13. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. In this passage, we can see three ways that David is actively depending on God. These three ways are to be modeled by believers even today and are still very applicable to us. And the first way we see David actively depending on God is by him actively expressing his pain to God. So how does actively expressing our pain to God show any sort of dependence? Well, it shows dependence because when we're expressing our pain to God, we are understanding that God is listening, that God cares, and that God has the power to relieve us from our pain. If we didn't believe any of those things, we wouldn't be expressing our pain to God in the first place. So there are three pains that we see David expressing to God, and the first pain that we see is that David is expressing the pain of feeling forgotten by God. Look down at verse 1 with me. Verse 1 says, How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? David feels like God has forgotten him and that God has hidden his face from him. Have you ever felt in your own life like God has forgotten you? Have you ever felt like God was hiding his face from you? I know that in the midst of many trials in my life that I've definitely felt that way. And I know that a lot of other Christians have felt this way as well. So what are we supposed to do when we feel this way? What are we supposed to do when we feel like God has forgotten us and turned his face from us? Well, we can express our pain to God just like David did in this psalm, but we can also rest upon the promises of God. We can look at a verse like Matthew 28:20, which says, "I am with you always to the end of the age." Now, the context of this verse is that Jesus is speaking to his disciples before he is about to ascend into heaven. And Jesus makes them a promise in the midst of probably a pretty scary and unknown time in their lives. The disciples may have felt that Jesus' presence had left them, but Jesus gives a promise to Christians of the day and for Christians today as well, that the Holy Spirit, whom the Father has sent to comfort us, will come and comfort them. And Christians can trust that whenever God feels far from us, that with the Holy Spirit we are kept safe in the presence of God. Not only was David feeling forgotten by God, but he's also feeling fearful. Look down at the first part of verse 2 with me. It says, "How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day?" David has great fear in his heart and it's laying very heavy in his heart because he has nobody to talk to about it with. Without anyone to help advise David, the only hope that he has is within himself. No one is there to advise him, and his only hope is to reside in his own heart. Have you ever been dealing with great fear and great sorrow in a trial, yet you feel as if you're not able to talk to anyone about it? Maybe you don't feel that any of your friends around you are going to understand what you're going through, that none of your family is going to understand, or you don't feel like that anyone around you is just going to care about what trial you're going through. But as a Christian, how might we respond in this trial? Well, once again, we can look what David decides to do in this psalm, and he expresses his pain to God. He expresses his feelings of feeling like no one else is there to listen to him. And we can also look at the promises of what Philippians 4, 6, and 7 says. Philippians 4, 6, and 7 says, "Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus." God promises us that he will give us peace in the midst of our trials if we simply express our pain and pray to him just as David did. So why don't we express our pain to God, even while knowing these truths? Well, the only answer must be that we must not fully understand or just don't fully trust in God and his promises. When we get a full grasp of God and his promises, and specifically that God is able to do something and is listening to our trials, then every single time we ought to express our pain to him. Finally, we see that David was not only feeling forgotten and fearful, but he's also feeling like a failure. Look down at the end of verse 2 with me. End of verse 2 says, "How long shall my enemy be exalted over me?" How often have you felt that despite doing the right thing, that your enemies are still coming out ahead of you? Because that's exactly what David's feeling. What are we supposed to do when we feel like such a failure? We feel like that even though every day we feel like we're doing the right thing, we may work in a secular workplace and we feel like although that you're the only one following God at your workplace, that you're still the one maybe in last place, still the one that seems to be the least successful. What are we supposed to do when we feel like this? Well, we need to do what David did and continue to express our pain and failure to God. And we can take confidence in Psalm 97:10, which says, "Ye that love the Lord hate evil. He preserveth the souls of his saints. He delivereth them out of the hand of the wicked." It can be very tempting to join in with sin when it seems like even though they're sinning and I'm not, that they're still more successful than me. It can be tempting in our head to say, why not just join in with this sin, even just one time? It's worked out for them all these several different times, and I've been doing good, and yet they're still ahead of me. So why not join in with the sin? Well, Psalm 97:10 says, "Ye that love the Lord hate evil." If you truly love the Lord, you're not going to give in to the evil and not give in to the pressures of this world. God has also promised to preserve the souls of his saints. And Psalm 97:10 is not just talking about our earthly lives, it's talking about our eternal lives as well. I've heard a lot of people that are not Christians and mostly secular maybe make fun of Christians in different passages like this that says that God's going to preserve the souls of his saints. But yet look at all these martyrs we can see in the Bible that Christians hold up high, or just even martyrs in church history. They may say that God hasn't preserved their souls. Some of them have died even very young. But that's not what Psalm 97:10 is talking about. It's talking about our eternal lives. And we can take confidence that no matter what situation that we're in, that God's going to hold us firmly in his hand for eternity. So when we're feeling like a failure and we feel like our enemies are surrounding us, we can express that pain to God and take heart that our enemies will not be exalted over us forever, and that God will preserve our lives for eternity. Not only did David show an act of dependence on God by expressing his pain, but he also showed an act of dependence on God through prayer. There are two aspects of David's prayer that we will see, and the first is David's request, and we can see this in verse 3. So look at verse 3 with me. It says, "Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death." David begins his prayer by asking God to consider him and hear him. And it's almost a reference to the first verse when David realizes that it feels like God is hiding his face from him. But now David is desperate. He's desperately asking God to turn his face, to look upon him. And when we feel like God's turned away from us, we need to pray exactly like this, with desperation. Because David prayed with such desperation because he realized he had no hope in anything else in this life except God. And having this desperation that David has comes only when we realize how much we actually need God in our lives. If we don't hold God very high in our lives, we're probably not going to have this same desperation if we think that other things in this life can satisfy just as God can. But as Christians, we must continue to remind ourselves always of how much we actually need God in our lives and how hopeless we are without him. So we've just looked at David's request in his prayer. Now we will look at the reason for his prayer in verse 4. Look down at your text with me in verse 4. It says, "Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him, lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken." David's prayer is not for selfish reasons. It's actually quite the opposite. The reason for David's prayer is for the preservation of God's glory. David realizes that he has publicly made known that God is his God, that the God of Israel, Yahweh, is his God. And he's afraid that if his enemies conquer over him, his enemies aren't just going to think they're conquering over him, David. They're going to think they're conquering over the God of Israel. And that is David's number one concern. His number one concern in his trial is that God would stay number one. So I just want you to think about your own lives and how often are we actually concerned about God's glory being shown in our trials. A lot of times, and I know for me as well, when I'm going through a trial, my number one thing is, how am I able to get out of this trial as fast as I can? How can I escape the pain as fast as I can? But that's not what David was concerned about. As Christians, we must make it a priority to see how we can best glorify God in every situation of our lives. So we've seen David's active expression of pain to God and David's active expression through prayer to God. And finally, we'll see David's praise to God. There are two parts to David's praise we see in this psalm. And the first one is that David praises God's love. And we can see this in verse 5. Verse 5 says, "But I've trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation." God has shown his love to David by being merciful to him. And as Christians, we can be confident and we can take trust in the mercies that God shows us every single day. We can look at how God has dealt with others, such as David, even in this passage, and we can see how he's been merciful despite David and all the sin that David's committed. We can also see the salvation that God has granted David, and we can be confident as Christians that no matter how difficult our situations get, that salvation we have received from God will endure through any trial. As Christians, we can be confident that God will show mercy on us through our trials and that God's salvation will endure with us, even our trials. And this fact should encourage us to praise God. So not only did David praise God's love, but he praised God's liberality. And we can see this in verse 6. Verse 6 says, "I'll sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." Liberality in the biblical sense refers to one who is generous and always willing to help. David trusts this fact of God by realizing that God has dealt bountifully with him before, and he'll continue to deal bountifully with him again. And just as we can go back and see how God has shown his love to other people and other characters and people of the Bible, we can do the same with God's liberality. And as Christians, it's very important for us to go back when we're in a trial, to look back and see what God has already brought us through, and take great heart in the fact that and then it will be a good reminder of all the goodness that God has already done in our lives. And looking at God's love and God's liberality, the first response from a Christian that fully understands this is for us to praise God. So we've looked at 3 ways that David is actively dependent on God. We've seen that David actively expresses his pain to God, he prays to God, and that he finally praises God. I'd like to close out by giving you 3 application points relating to each of the main points. First, I challenge you that whenever you're going through some sort of trial or pain, that you would first express it to God before you go to any one of your friends or family. Often it's our first instinct to maybe vent to our friends about our problems, but we must make it a habit to always go to God first. It's not wrong at all to go to godly friends and have them give godly advice to us. We must make it a habit that we're going to God first and that he's our ultimate trust. Second, I challenge that when you pray to God, you'd pray with him with an urgency and a desperation, just as David did. David realized that without God, he had no hope, and we must have that same realization even today. And not just pray to God just in order to check off a box that we have, or just because our pastor told us to. No, we must pray to God because he ultimately is our only hope. And finally, I challenge you to make praising God an active part of your life. Try praying through the Psalms, or even pray to God without asking any requests and just praising him. I remember in the youth group, Pastor Ben made us do this a few years ago. He challenged us to try to pray a prayer where we gave no request, and all we did was just praise God. And it can be very difficult at first, because often our first instinct when we do pray is asking God for things. And it's not wrong, but as Christians, we must make praising God an active part of our lives. However, David was not able to, and we were not able to have an active dependence on God through our own strength. We must ask God first to help us have strength, to have an active dependence on him. And I challenge you, just to make the decision before you go to bed tonight, that you would pray to God and ask him to help you have an active dependence on him. So let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity to be able to look in your word and look in the Psalms. We thank you for the model of active dependence that you've given us through David. And I pray that you just help us to remember this anytime we're going through a trial, that when we are going through a trial, that maybe we would just open up Psalm 13 and remind ourselves of how you intended us to respond in a trial. I pray for all of us here that we would want to have an active dependence like David, and that when we do go through a trial, that we would have an active dependence on you. Amen.